Hello and welcome to iNN's Headline News and Beyond for April 2nd, 2012. And we begin off the first half of our broadcast tonight, of our report tonight, with domestic affairs as we always do, and we will have foreign affairs in the second half. Well, today it was the basically the usual suspects in the news: the U.S. primary, Trayvon Martin, uh, and the typical wrangling back and forth over uh, Republican and Democratic policies. And just to clarify our stance here, I think there needs to be a little bit of a qualification. And the qualification is not your degree or how good you are. It's simply an argument or a statement that sort of states a position, so you have an understanding of where things are coming from. Now, you've been here talking about uh, Obama as a socialist or a social democrat, uh, and the likes. And a lot of times you'll hear on the news, particularly in Fox News, people call, and on the right, people calling Obama and the other like-minded Democrats socialists. Well, the thing is that you need to understand that there is more than one type of socialist. The socialists that most people toss out are the sort of the left socialists, or social left, the social left. Uh, but there is also a social right uh, that also exists. Both of them are socialist, but one is opposed to the other, and they are actually they're not only contradictory to each other, but they're in competition with each other. They're basically opposed to it. So you can hear someone who is anti-communist talking about Obama as a communist and saying how he supports democracy, but if you listen to certain key phrases and the things that they're and what they're saying, you'll understand the person is not talking about uh, uh, really about talking about democracy, but he's actually talking about socialism on the left. And a lot of the time, socialism on the left is socialism on the right. I should say that this is the correction here. Socialism on the right. A social right person will talk about nationalism. They'll talk about national identity. Uh, in many cases, their issue is on race and the differences between the races. What they call the human race, the different races, within humanity, not other types of races, sporting races. And so what happens? So you have communism on the left. That's your If you go to the left side of the socialist spectrum, you have communism on your furthest most left. And then if you go to the right, you have Nazism or National Socialism, which is the furthest on the right. You will find that the National Socialists will typically be, in many cases, they'll be corporatists. They will talk about corporate values and business. They'll talk about uh, free market enterprise and so on and so forth. But when you actually look at what they're doing and you see how they're moving towards consolidation of capital or cornering a particular market, uh, you'll find that their arguments, as you start lifting and looking beneath them, are anything but democratic. And I can point this out to Fox News, because Fox always talks about they have a lot of people on who say they're constitutionalists and they want constitutionally minded judges. And if you go down and scroll down to the bottom of Fox's page, you'll see this down there. There'll be copyright, and then the copyright claim there it says this material may not be published, broadcast, rewritten, or redistributed, and that's the copyright claim. So in other words, you cannot talk about the broadcast, you cannot rewrite the broadcast. In other words, they will censor you from any attempt to criticize or knock any of their materials if you're going to use their content. We want to try to use their content against them, or as an argument to showing where they're wrong. They'll actually come out and censor you on this. And this is from a group who claimed to be Republican. They claimed to be interested in free speech. And when you see and live behind the rhetoric, are they for free speech? And you see and hear, no, they're not for free speech. That they're for DCA, they're for Protect IP, they're for SOPA, and a lot of these other more Orwellian laws. Then you can now argue that these people, well, if they're not Democrats, if they're not I'm talking about proper Democrats, these are people who are properly centered, not social left, believing in a true individual American democracy, and that's what true Americanism is, a belief in individual democracy. It's the individual above the state. As soon as you move into socialist arguments, either right or left, you're talking about the state imposing or taking control over the individual, that the state has precedent over the individual. And that you're now, instead of looking towards individual justice, you're now talking in terms of social justice or the benefits for the society at large. So if you hear anyone talking about X, Y, and Z has to be done for the greater good of society, that person's a socialist. Because that is the motto for this type of society, is that you want to you want to open up and present your ideas as being beneficial for the greater good of society, and therefore the group over there, this group that you disapprove of, doesn't believe this way, and so they should be eliminated or should be pushed to the side because it's for the greater good of society. And so what happens is you have to be careful, because you do have not only socialism on the left, but you have socialism on the right. And what's happening now is we do have this sort of dynamic playing out, where we have two forms of socialism coming into play in the United States. These two extreme ends are battling each other out, and if you're an independent like I am, and an independent, what you should be is the independents shouldn't be socialists on either side, but they should be people who are for individual values, and that means smaller government, lower taxes, and it's because it's up to the individual to decide what he wants to do. It's an individually based society. And that's where an independent is supposed to be. You're not supposed to have any alliances or allegiances to any particular group. And this, as such as myself, I have no ties and haven't joined any particular group, because I am an individualist. I'm an independent, and I don't believe in belonging to any particular one group. Ironically, even my religion's like this. It's a very my religion, although it has a church, the church is the family, the church is the house, and it's not the institution. So when I'm walking into a church, I'm not walking into an institution. I'm walking into my house. That's so that's the sort of the familiarity with it. The relationship with myself to the church is, this is my family. God is my father. I've been invited to become because I've been invited to become a son of God or a child of God. That means Christ is my brother. So this is where, if you can look at a theology, and all of a sudden the theology sort of does away with that and starts looking at the God Almighty. What they've done is they've removed God the Father, and are now start looking at the institutional church. And now that's where you have your ministers and all these sort of orders, these hierarchical orders, who are ministers to the King of God, God the King. And the focus of the family is more or less gone. And you can see this in some of these more institutional style churches. My church isn't like this. My theology isn't like this. It's very individualistic, and So are my political views. They're very individualistic. There's no one particular allegiance to one group or another. That being said, we go back into where I'm now starting to look at some of the biases within CNN and within Fox, with all these different things. I've gotten a little more done and sort of now starting to sort of separate some of the things. And the two that I'm going to point out that I'm going to, because they are in the prime time now, that's Aaron Burnett and Anderson Cooper. They show how that even though Aaron Burnett is much better than Anderson Cooper, what happens is that her bias forms in the information that she leaves out of her broadcast. And I'll go to this today when we're going to the Trayvon Martin case. And they were talking about this new audio section that they were working on to see whose voice was that screaming on the tape for help. And Aaron Burnett simply played the section that it was from this expert who claims that he was able to decipher who it was exactly on the tape, and he said he knew for certain that this was the voice of the victim Trayvon Martin, and not George Zimmerman. And Aaron Burnett asked him how he could know this, and he says, "Well, this is the scientific, accuracy here," but he didn't go into it and elaborate how he actually knew this. When you go to Anderson Cooper, there's a much longer clip of what they're actually doing and the sort of analysis. And the clip, even though the guy reiterates and states his assertion, you see that all the work is done by software. He doesn't do any of the analysis. It's all done by software. So he's simply reporting what the computer, the research and the analysis that was done by the computer. It wasn't done by him. This expert actually has no knowledge of what actually transpired. He's simply reporting what the computer has told him. And the computer has come up, does do this when they're doing analysis, and this is true for any scientific analysis. There are always errors, but there's always a percentage of uncertainty. Now, what they were showing on the screen there is that, because they showed the screen of what he was doing, and they were showing the level of uncertainty, but again, they glossed over this. They glossed over the uncertainty and made it behave as if this guy was 100% sure this wasn't George Zimmerman. But the problem is that the way it was done, and if you know science, and if you're a scientific researcher like I am, then you have several troubling questions. One, where are your error bars? Where is your uncertainty? Because there is always some degree of uncertainty, whether it's 5%, 10%, and in some cases in science, in analysis, your uncertainty could be as high as 50%. And from some of the numbers that they were showing on there, as they were panning across the screen, I saw numbers on uncertainty close to 50%. So if this was indeed the case, that you had numbers of 50% or around that area there, even if it was down to 40%, you had 40% uncertainty. There's no way that you can say this was George Zimmerman, because the uncertainty says no. If you're at that 40 to 50% mark, then saying that it's George Zimmerman on the tape there, or not George Zimmerman in the audio, is the analysis is as certain as it is if you had flipped a coin and it had come up the side that you wanted it to come up on. So the certainty in terms of that not being George Zimmerman on the audio for the cry for help, my suspicion is that the analysis more or less failed, because it didn't produce a conclusive result. It produced an inconclusive result, a 50-50 result in that area there. If it's between 40 and 60%, your error area there, then you basically have something that's uncertain. The only time you can claim something is somewhat certain is if you're below the 35% mark in terms of 35% error. as soon as you get to that 35% error mark, then you need to start asking yourself what went wrong with the experiment, if there anything did go wrong, or what was wrong with your measurements, because you now have a 35% uncertainty. You're getting close to that mark where you really can't say that what you see here is with any degree of certainty that it's real. And so you do need to go in and investigate. And this was never done. This was sort of left out in the open. And what's been happening, and this is sort of what I've been finding out, and sort of chasing down another source about the tapes that were sort of in the sections of the conversation, the 911 tapes that were left out, really call into question what's going on the media side of things, and whether or not the media is actually creating a story that really doesn't exist. And this sort of this was actually the intonation of Fox today on the O'Reilly factor, and he was interviewing somebody else, I guess, who was either a contributor to Fox or something. Because that's the way they usually do it. Even though they bring up independent consultants, in some way or form, these independent consultants that they're bringing up are friends of Fox or friends of the station, or CNN does the exact same thing. They're all sort of interrelated. They don't really bring up any heavy opposition to what they're saying. What they're doing is they're bringing up somebody who can more or less confirm what they're saying or reporting in the news. They don't really present the opposing view. And so what they were saying is that NBC had fabricated the story, that they left certain chunks out of it. Bill O'Reilly was trying to be more conciliatory in saying that maybe this was a mistake by a segment producer, but the person who was sort of the I guess you call it the expert that they were talking to, or the independent consultant, the independent analyst was who was on there with them. I can't remember what his name is now. Was saying that this was something had to be more deliberate, because if this was a case that was a mistake, somebody would have been fired, and there would have been a reporter that this was an error. So this is what they're pointing out, and this is something we've known for a while now, that CNN, Fox, all these, even Fox is guilty of this, of creating news or fixing things up. We've seen this on Anderson Cooper. We don't see this as much on Aaron Burnett. What we see in terms of the bias on Aaron Burnett is we see that, as I said, information is left out, and only certain chunks that would push people in one direction. In this case, the direction that the Trayvon Martin case is something that racially biased. This is what's reported, and the other side is more or less slowly but slowly sort of reduced, so all you have is one particular side. And what they were talking about, as they continue going on talking about this, and this is both sides of the issue here, talking about this whole Trayvon Martin thing has brought up a whole issue of race again in the United States. And Anderson Cooper wasn't on air tonight because he was out doing a study, and this was now promoted as a study on race, and they were talking to black kids about certain things about race. But here's the problem with these so-called studies, is that you're not seeing the full thing. You're not seeing all of their lab notes. You're only seeing bits and chunks of things. And knowing CNN, knowing Anderson Cooper, there's an enormous chunk out there. And then the question you have to ask yourself is that what's Anderson Cooper not showing you in these results? How did you get these results? What questions did you ask? How did you ask the questions? Who asked the questions? Because all these things matter. And when you start throwing that stuff out, you start throwing out the details, and simply reporting what you view as the results are, then that's biased reporting. And you're not reporting the news, you're creating the news. And Anderson Cooper is guilty of this, not in just one area, but over and over again. He's guilty of this. So, and this is the thing, is that when you go to various different these pundits on the air, like Anderson Cooper and Bill O'Reilly and stuff like that. You really have to be careful with what you're listening to, because it can sound right, it can sound logical, but in many cases, if you don't ask yourself the full question, starting digging behind what's being said, you're not going to know the full story. You really do have to dig. You do have to look, and understanding what's going to happen in the news is not a short-term thing anymore. If you're just interested in the headlines, like a small splurb, and you're not really interested in the news, my suggestion to you is simply watch somebody like Jay Leno or David Letterman. Get your news from there, because no news channel, whether it's ABC, NBC, CNN, Fox, or whatever, no matter how deep their voice is, no matter how news like they sound, they're still entertainment, and that's all you're going to get from them is entertainment. So if this is what you want, this is your excitement and entertainment, fine. If you don't want to sit in there and watch the news and really find out what's going on, and these people, really don't interest you, watch one of the comedians, because you're gonna get as much and maybe a little bit more than you would actually get on the news from the comedians. And that's sort of the state of news and journalism today, because the news and journalism has been infiltrated by PR. It also has been infiltrated by various different political intelligence groups. So if you have and this is known in the intelligence and covert groups, that the best way to start a war is to get into the news environment and make it behave as if there's a revolt going on in the society, and you can overthrow that government, you can overthrow the regime by creating broadcasts that make it look like there's a war going on in the country, when this whole war thing is really staged, and you're the one funding the so-called rebels, the freedom fighters, to revolt against the particular regime, and then that way you can certainly overthrow a regime like that. This was done and was realized. It's not something new. This is actually something old. It was done during the Vietnam War. That you had on both sides of the aisle, you had both the North Vietnamese communists, and on the right, the Americans, the American intelligence, on the streets of the United States in these different groups, pushing and trying to manipulate the situation in their favor. And so a lot of these things were not necessarily spontaneous. You had a lot of things being pushed through the universities and through these idealistic professors who call themselves idealists and have these philosophical bents. But if you really test out these, see, here's the thing: most of these professors, the academic professors who have these views on how government should be run and should behave, they're cowards. Because they're sitting there with a nice fat paycheck. Their paycheck is not really going to be in danger at all, and yet they're sending these kids out, the younger kids, the students out, to do the work that they're afraid to do. They won't get involved in politics. They won't, they always have some degree of an excuse why they're not president or why they're not a senator, as they are this professor. There's no reason why a professor of political science, who's supposed to be this great intellectual, isn't a senator, isn't a governor, isn't the president. I mean, there's no reason why a sitting president couldn't teach at a university as a professor. There's no reason why a vice president couldn't do the same thing. And so if they're not of this value, they're not sort of, you need to sort of start questioning them and saying, well, do they really understand what they're talking about? And then if they're talking about communism and being fair and everything like this, then why are they taking the paycheck that they're taking? Why don't they take their paycheck and start giving it out to all their students, and let them say, oh, fine, here's part of my salary. Or if things are a concept, well, a paycheck is a concept, so you don't need your paycheck if you don't need if everything is a concept, right? And they're teaching about, and they're philosophizing about concepts in this existential philosophy, then why should they be paid in this concept? Because payment is a concept. And if And then so not payment is a concept either. One concept is the other. If no view matters, and you're a nihilist and you're promoting this nihilist philosophy, or you're promoting the anarchist philosophy, these are all existential philosophies. Then there's no reason why these professors have to be paid. And the thing is, I guarantee you, if you start challenging these professors, these who have these views, on their views, that the response is not going to be as open-minded as you think it is. Particularly, if you really start challenging their their pay. If you start hitting their paycheck and start going after their paycheck, these people are not going to be as altruistic as you think they're going to be, and the response is going to be very much along the Republican lines, that they need this money, and they basically, what they are is they're elitists with a lot of money who love to hear their own voice. This is primarily what most academic these thinkers are like that, and it's not about what they have to sacrifice. It's about what you have to sacrifice, and you following what they have to say, and about their own position in your view, in their in that way their own form of society. So this is what's going on in domestic affairs. We're now going to move on to the second half in a few minutes. I will see you on the other side for the second half of INN's Headlines and Beyond.